I first became aware of Jordan Peterson through his Maps of Meaning lectures on YouTube. I was astonished at Jordan's ability to interpret and explain many of the latent symbolisms scattered throughout ancient human civilization. I still recall his lecture on the mythology of ancient Egypt and the symbolism of the pyramids. I was awestruck by the depth and beauty of his explanation, transforming in a mere few minutes an old husk of a mythology into a real and living transcendental truth. I was hooked, feeling the immense privilege of those who were able to listen to those words in person. Pretty soon, everyone would enjoy this privilege, as he toured through the universities of North America, delivering lectures on a great many subjects in philosophy and psychology, including the famous Bible series, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Now, it just so happened that the majority of his online listening audience were men, even when he never intended it to be that way. The question of why men specifically have gravitated to Peterson's messaging more than women was always up in the air. Peterson, in his explosive interview with Kathy Newman, explains that it's just because, quote, YouTube is dominated by men and Tumblr is dominated by women, and I post mainly on YouTube, unquote. Ergo, that's why you see a lot of men. Later on a podcast with Crowder, he mentioned how Penguin's brand management software found out that almost 55% of his audience at the time, that was near 2018, was composed of women. So it appears that men are not even the majority of his audience, and yet, there cannot be any doubt that Peterson's hardcore and most ardent fans seem almost always to be men. So what is it about Jordan Peterson that attracts so many ardent male fans? After watching countless lectures and interviews of Jordan, I think I've finally understood why that is. Jordan's messaging and tone consistently exhibits the archetype of a wise and benevolent protector, eager to improve his listeners and spur them to action. This, I believe, resembles the kind of fatherly archetype to which many men naturally gravitate, and most especially young boys of fatherless households. Considering the epidemic of fatherlessness in America, it's no wonder that so many young boys and men of today found in Jordan the voice of encouragement, for which they've been endlessly yearning. Jordan never shied away from this explanation, sometimes explaining in tears how he's read countless letters from boys and men thanking him for saving them from the brink of destruction. It's a great crime that mainstream media held that against him, as if the improvement of young boys and men, including literally saving their lives, somehow meant the downfall of women or the indirect support of the incel community. But Jordan was already marked because, unlike other public intellectuals, he dared to speak of the unspeakable. He came in support of masculinity and the wisdom of the Bible. In hindsight, it's hard to see his treatment in the media to have gone any other way. In the eyes of virtually all mainstream media establishments, he became public enemy number one, instead of the public intellectual that everyone else saw him. And throughout it all, when the media dragged his reputation through the mud, twisting and fabricating all his words and deeds, and painting him as the cartoon villain of a so-called patriarchy, Jordan kept close his most precious rule. He always told the truth, or at least never lied. Sometime in 2019, Jordan disappeared off the face of the earth. Almost a year later, his daughter uploads a video explaining how Jordan has been recovering from a serious illness over the past year. Even though the details are still shrouded in mystery, we later learn that he had suffered from a serious benzodiazepine withdrawal symptoms that almost took his life. He was prescribed benzo to cope at a time when his wife was in the hospital for another serious illness. The whole incident was a horrible tragedy, but something which everyone had wondered is whether his benzo usage was also tied to the constant pestering and hounding of the media against him during his rise to fame. We never get any clear details, but it's probable that a combination of both factors, his wife's illness as well as the media's attacks against him, created a stressful enough condition in his life that justified his prescription of benzo, paving the way for its horrible consequences post-withdrawal. Throughout the rest of this essay, I will refer to this incident as the fall, because in my opinion, it marks a clear change in Peterson's character and style of thought. This is the change that, from my point of view, represented the biggest tragedy for the whole world, and one that I don't think we've gotten over. After his resurgence in 2021, Peterson began actively uploading and engaging with many prominent individuals on his podcast. But something smelled different this time. There was a deep sense of urgency in Peterson's general rhetoric and demeanor, and a slight tinge of combativeness in tone when discussing certain matters or issues. Initially brushing aside these concerns as the manifestations of an eagerness to make up for lost time with his audience, I continued to closely follow and watch his channel and much of his content. But right out of the blue, almost a year into his resurgence, we find Peterson uploading a video where the background is a vast, white, and empty space, heaven-like and serene, with himself in the foreground explaining, or more like justifying, why he decided to join the Daily Wire. At the time, everyone knew that Ben Shapiro's network was heavily involved in the ongoing so-called culture war, and Peterson's decision to join their team undeniably meant that he's made the decision to not only engage in such a war, but also to pick a side. And to describe Peterson as warlike in this phase of his development would not be an understatement. His famous video where he sat in an ominous dark background, yelling "sons of bitches" after his Twitter ban accurately reflects this laughably antagonistic state of mind that characterized much of Jordan's thought after the fall. That's not to say that some of these issues would not make your blood boil, but that was never the sort of rhetoric that we generally expected from the wise and eminent psychologist, a rhetoric betraying an almost vengeful, self-righteous character, hell-bent on crushing those opposed to him. The best description of Peterson at this stage is the one portrayed by the comedian Tim Dillon. Jordan, after the fall, feels like the final form of a Batman villain.
He's been through it.
Yeah.
He's been through the ringer.
Been through the ringer.
And he's a brilliant guy. He's a smart guy.
Yep.
But he looks right now like he's in his final form, which is a Batman villain. Like he seems to be.
Of course, what Tim had in mind is Two-Face, the villain who emerged from the trauma experienced by Harvey Dent. And indeed, Peterson has transformed into a hideous character that, to me and many others, is wholly unrecognizable and more challenging to understand. And I cannot help but think that this transformation owes much of its origin to his abuse by the press and the elite class before the fall, where it can be argued that it put his own and family's life at risk. Lex Friedman, in one of his episodes with Peterson, attempted to relay this insight by reading to him Nietzsche's famous quote:
"Battle not with monsters, lest ye become a monster.
Yeah.
And if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you."
Right. But I would say, bring it on. Right? Because that's why I also say, knowing that he's absolutely right, but if you gaze into the abyss long enough, you see the light, not the darkness.
Are you sure about that?
I'm betting my life on it.
Yeah, that's a heck of a bet.
Lex's laugh in the middle sort of gives it away, because it's not clear what Jordan meant by his response. It sounded like a cheap deflection of an observation that mattered to many of his eager followers since his emergence on the public stage. Or it can be interpreted as a normalization of his transformation as a monster, that, being a monster, he no longer sees the dark as dark, but as light. But you don't have to go that far to explain Peterson's remarkable change in character. His new Two-Face attire describes this monumental shift in thought much better than anything else. Are we to expect that an extremely intelligent public intellectual, professing psychology for decades, is in this case simply trying out a new fashion trend? Or, like Two-Face, this attire represents an expression of a complete and unreserved embrace of his transformation, in full public display to the whole world? Indeed, the Joker must be laughing all the way to the bank. There's another aspect to this shift in character and tone that I believe is far more pernicious, if only because it is too subtle to see. Jordan's rhetoric before the fall usually included positive messaging that reflected the deep wisdom of the ancients, messaging that is far more conducive to actually changing people's lives. So instead of telling you, "Don't steal," Peterson said, "Clean your room," or "Tell the truth." These were practical, actionable items that were intended to transform your life and all of society for the better. And they generally reflected the deep values that our culture believed in and upheld, at least in theory. Peterson, after the fall, on the other hand, had almost exclusively limited himself to the sort of negative, reactionary messaging that is all too common throughout American politics and the so-called culture war. You no longer hear exhortations about cleaning your room or telling the truth. Instead, a screeching diatribe on how the other side is emasculating young boys is in order. Broadly speaking, This is a general feature of modern discourse in America, and specifically American politics. Politicians and the so-called intellectual class at the moment are intensely focused on mocking and demonizing the opposite side, while simultaneously offering nothing of substance on how people actually should conduct their lives or run their country. Regardless of the underlying reasons of this phenomenon, it seems to have swallowed Peterson whole. But the final nail in the coffin has to be Peterson's latest X/Twitter feed, which sound like the ramblings of an unhinged maniac if you never knew the account posting them. There's a large catalog of Jordan Peterson content locked behind a paywall on Ben Shapiro's network, The Daily Wire, which probably means that a large portion of his former audience, young men, will sadly never get to hear it. Some of this content is fascinating, but virtually all of the new content smells of that corporate, uncreative imagination that is orders of magnitude different from the type of content that Jordan used to spontaneously produce before the fall, like the famous Bible series. It's worth contrasting what happened to Jordan Peterson with the recent events related to Tucker Carlson. Tucker was originally enmeshed within the corporate news cycle at Fox. As time went on, he became increasingly inclined to speak of topics that were considered forbidden, causing him to eventually get fired by the network. But life couldn't get better for Tucker after this incident. He's enjoying a renaissance moment, with hundreds of millions of views on X from all over the world, and an international reputation that allows him to meet with distinguished individuals all over the world to discuss whatever topics he desires. Jordan, on the other hand, seems to have started with the kind of freedom and intellectual innocence that Tucker at the moment enjoys, and yet somehow ended up within a corporate network that forces his content behind a paywall and muzzles his ability to publish and produce whatever content he desires to the public at large. But this point is moot when we consider that the Jordan of today is a different beast from the Jordan before the fall. The old Jordan Peterson is, for all intents and purposes, dead. In my view, Jordan's arc symbolizes the age-old story about the fate of great men in societies that are not yet ready to accept their wisdom. If they are not crucified like Jesus or given the hemlock like Socrates, they will be hounded and persecuted from every turn and angle until they transform into the very monsters they are fighting. And just like the ending of The Dark Knight, we'd be wise to preserve the old memory of Jordan against his new transformation. But we can no longer do so at the expense of blinding ourselves to the impact of evil and malevolence on the good men and women of our society. Our hope, and the fate of civilization depends on it, must lie in the belief that our society will produce more good people than not. That even though evil and malevolence can never be eliminated and will boast of many victims along the way, our society, ever so slowly, still marches on towards the path of truth and virtue. Men die and become corrupted, but principles never die. Jordan's writings and works before the fall must stand on their own as the expression of eternal truths about humanity, masculinity, and the world at large. I will solemnly cherish them, forever serving the dual purpose of enlightening the soul and a stark reminder of the tragic consequences of malevolence on it.
And while Horus and Osiris, or Seth are fighting, Seth tears out one of his eyes. Now why? Because Seth is the embodiment of destruction and malevolence, and no matter how conscious you are, if you encounter that, even voluntarily, the probability that it's going to damage your consciousness is extraordinarily high. That's why people don't do it.